Next month, May 1960, was the 18th Monaco Grand Prix. Rear-engine cars had made their mark the previous year, culminating in Jack Brabham's Cooper Climax, winning the World Championship. The first Grand Prix of the 1960 season had been the Argentine, where Bruce McLaren in a Cooper took up where he left off in 1959 by winning from Cliff Allison's Ferrari. In his Ireland, in the new rear-engined Lotus 18, finished 6th after a spin. Back home in Britain, at the Easter Monday Goodwood, Ireland won. Then at the International Trophy at Silverstone, the Lotus 18s trounced the opposition, with Ireland winning both the Formula 1 and Formula 2 races, and Jimmy Clark winning the Formula Junior race. It was becoming obvious that the Lotus was the car to have, so much so that Sterling Moss had persuaded Rob Walker to buy one. And so on the Thursday morning, in a little Monaco back street, I found the Yeoman Credit team making some last-minute preparations. The team had entered its Cooper Climaxes for Tony Brooks and Chris Bristow. Brooks had left Ferrari as he had given himself no chance of winning the World Championship in a front-engine car. Yeoman Credit also had a spare third car for practice. This was my third visit to Monaco, and I was enjoying it more each time. On the harbour are the main grandstands opposite the pits, which are under the trees between the start area and the return leg of the course. Then on to the gasworks hairpin, where the circuit joins the normal traffic route back to Saint-Devote. Up the hill, past Rosie's bar, to the casino. The cars then vanish into the town through a series of corners and past the railway station. Finally, the cars emerge out of the tunnel before dropping down to the chicane and then the left-hander at Tabac, and so along the harbour back to the pits. In the paddock, Graham Hill watched Sterling Moss try his new Rob Walker-entered rear-engined Lotus 18. Ferrari had brought 4 cars, 3 front-engine Dino 246s and the new, first-ever rear-engine Ferrari, also using the Dino 246 V6 engine. Another new car was the American-built Scarab. This front-engine car housed a 4-cylinder engine with desmodromic valve gear mated to a 4-speed Chevrolet Corvette gearbox. The cars are built and financed by Lance Revenclaw, here preparing for his first outing on a European circuit. The second Scarab was driven by fellow American Chuck Day. The Scarabs are beautifully prepared and built, but were obviously overweight, underpowered, and quite clearly already out of date. Cliff Allison was driving the front-engine Dino 246, with its engine now turned to the right instead of the left. It also featured a new gearbox and final drive and independent rear suspension by double wishbones and coil springs. In Rob Walker's pit, Alf Francis chatted to Sterling, who was about to make his debut in the Lotus Climax. Betty Walker checked the times of the competition. And of course, of Sterling. But due to an electrical fault in the timing gear, the official timekeepers had to declare the whole session null and void. Wouldn't happen at Goodwood, I thought to myself, as I wandered back to Rosie's for an aperitif before dinner. The sun shone, so we had no difficulty in relaxing at Monte Carlo. either by swimming or by sitting by the sea or even bathing in the sun. We only hoped that the timekeepers would fix their stopwatches. The final practice session was on the Saturday evening. American Richie Ginther, newcomer to the Ferrari team, was entrusted with the new rear-engine car. Von Trips and a rather sleepy Phil Hill had their engines in the proper place. 24 entries had been accepted, but only the fastest 16 cars would be allowed to start the race. This, combined with the abandoned first practice, meant that this session was to be particularly frantic. Phil Hill seemed to have woken up. Jack Brabham warmed his car up quite gently on the inside of the course. Colin Chapman was anxious to hear what Sterling thought about his new Lotus. And then Rob Walker checked some last-minute points with Alf Francis and Moss before Sterling ventured back out onto the track. Now no longer with the Walker team, Maurice Trintignant was trying all he knew to qualify Scuderia Centro Sud's Cooper Maserati, finally just taking the last place. Sunday afternoon, May the 29th. The sun was shining, but the sky looked threatening. Alf Francis was deep in conversation with the Ferrari team manager, Tavoni. He was inquiring about Cliff Allison, who was in hospital after a crash in practice. Von Trips was on the third row of the grid, with Phil Hill and Richie Ginther in the rear-engine Ferrari was on the fourth row. Another new rear-engine car was the BRM, which Bonnier had qualified well in fifth place. Tony Brooks qualified third and Chris Bristow fourth in the beautifully turned out Yeoman Credit Coopers. Roy Salvadori, driving a 1959 Cooper for C.T. Atkins, was down in 12th. The Works Cooper team had the world champion Jack Brabham in second, but teammate Bruce McLaren had struggled in practice and lined up only 11th. Sterling Moss was Rob Walker's sole entrant and had been quickest in practice. The Lotus Works team had Innes Ireland, Alan Stacey and John Surtees getting his first real taste of four-wheel racing. Chapman chatted to Count Johnny Lurani from Italy, no mean motorist himself. The crowd waited patiently for the start, while in front of the pits, the Monaco police kept everybody in order. Louis Chiron, winner here for Bugatti in 1931, had the benefit of his experience to pass on to Sterling. Raymond Mays of BRM was as immaculate as ever, and Maurice Trintignant discussed his slim prospects starting from the back of the grid in his Cooper Maserati. Prince Rainier and Princess Grace did a tour of the circuit before the race. They seemed to have abandoned American metal. At last, at nearly 3 o'clock, the cars were arranged on the grid. In pole position was Moss in the Lotus, with a time of 1 minute 37.7. The slowest was Trintignant, with a time of 1 minute 39.1. Even this was half a second better than last year's quickest time. When the race started, Joe Bonnier sneaked through into the lead as all the front row suffered excessive wheel spin. Into station hairpin on the first lap, the order was Bonnier, Brabham, Moss, Brooks, Bristow and the rest of the field nose to tail. The harbour wall is not used for everyday traffic, so it takes a few laps for the dust to clear. Second lap, still Bonnier, Brabham, Moss, then Brooks, Phil Hill, Bristow, Ireland and Graham Hill. A gap to Surtees and McLaren. And then another gap to Salvadori, Ginther, Trintignant, Von Trips, Gurney and Stacey completing the 16 starters. At the end of lap 2, the cars had strung out a little. By the 5th lap, Moss had moved into second place. Bonnier and Sterling were now well ahead of the rest. Brabham was third, but dropping back. Then came Brooks, Phil Hill, Ireland, Bristow and Graham Hill. At intervals, Bonnier waved Moss past, but Sterling said, "No thanks, you've got yourself there, you set the pace." At the gasworks, Brabham led a gaggle of 6 cars, all catching the leaders, Bonnier and Moss. Their approach encouraged Moss to take the lead from Bonnier on lap 17. Sterling immediately began to draw away, while Bonnier found Brabham, Brooks and Phil Hill filling his mirrors. Moss's lead increased appreciably lap by lap, and then Bonnier was overwhelmed by Brabham. And then on lap 28, the threatened rain began to fall. Sterling was signalled that Brabham, now in second place, was only 7 seconds behind him. Moss slowed to a sensible pace, but Brabham continued to push and caught and passed him. The order was now Brabham, Moss, Bonnier, who had lapped the rear-engine Ferrari of Ginther in last place. The rain which fell on the polished tarmac turned the Monte Carlo streets into an ice rink. Brabham spun at Saint-Devote, hit a wall and bent the chassis of his coupe. Moss's caution had been justified. He was back in the lead, leaving Jack to walk back to the pits, wondering about what might have been. Von Trips nearly went straight on at the station. Moss was keeping to the driest part of the road. McLaren spun but managed to recover. Phil Hill did likewise, but kept the Ferrari's power on and executed an impressive recovery. The rain stopped. Bonnier motored on in second, now 14 seconds behind Moss. McLaren and Graham Hill in third and fourth were being caught by Phil Hill until he nearly overdid it again. By lap 50, half distance, all looked well for Moss. Bonnier in second lapped Von Trips's Ferrari. Ireland's Lotus had been misfiring for a long time, and now, going up the hill by the Hotel de Paris, the engine cut out altogether. Down to the station, Phil Hill had taken third, but could not shake off McLaren. Graham Hill in the BRM was fifth. At the casino, cars were passing much less frequently now, only 8 cars still racing. Von Trips had retired with clutch failure, and egged on by his shirt-sleeved friend John Dalton, Innes Ireland had decided to push his car back to the pits, some 1¼ miles away. Had he stopped to look at the engine, he would have seen that it had only cut out due to the magneto-earthing wire chafing through on the rev counter drive. Meanwhile, on lap 60, Moss's engine went on to 3 cylinders. He called at his pit and found a plug lead had fallen off. Bonnier took the lead, but was soon caught again by Moss. As Alf Francis looked on, the Lotus regained the lead. If Sterling could win this one, it would be his 13th World Championship victory, equaling the record of the great Alberto Ascari. On lap 78, poor Joe Bonnier retired when the rear suspension collapsed on his BRM. McLaren overtook Phil Hill to take 2nd place. Innes Ireland finally made it, arriving exhausted at the finish line. In 4th, and now amazingly last place, was the Yeoman Credit Cooper of Tony Brooks. With only 4 cars running, the walking wounded desperately tried to get going again as 2 World Championship point-scoring places were on offer. Brabham restarted his bent Cooper, Bonnier got going again, Gurney set off with a loose rear wheel, and Ginther pushed his car as Ireland had done. Moss went on to win. He and entrant Rob Walker had now done for Lotus what they had done for Cooper 2 years ago in Argentina, given them their first Grand Prix victory.